It is Friday, November 28th. Let's talk PlayStation. Welcome back, everyone, to another Thanksgiving episode of LTPS. As always, let's begin with our PS Plus reminder, and this is your final warning for the November PS Plus Essential lineup. So make sure you claim those games before they go away. This coming Tuesday, on the 2nd, it's going to change over to 5 total games, so 2 bonus titles. We have LEGO Horizon Adventures, PS5, Killing Floor 3, PS5, The Outlast Trials, PS4, PS5, Sin Duality, Echo of Ada, PS5, and then Neon White, PS4, PS5 as well. So a very diverse lineup of games. Neon White is fantastic. That game is so fun, highly addictive. It's a speedrunning, trial and error kind of game, so for a lot of folks that might not be the gameplay loop you enjoy, but for those that are into it, it is just so addictive. Sin Duality, I know, is like a PvPvE mech style game, so that might not be for everybody, but Outlast, great for horror. Killing Floor 3 was like a 6, 7-ish out of 10, great for subscription. And LEGO Horizon, which that game is, it's a really fun LEGO game. It's maybe more repetitive than the other LEGO games, because I feel like all of them tend to feel very repetitive, but this one more so than the others. But it's like a gorgeous looking LEGO game as well. So it's great to see that game go into PS Plus Essential, the lowest tier, so fast, because the game pretty much did have some soft sales, but otherwise not bad. It's always great when we get more than 3 titles for PS Plus Essential, and most of them are really good. Now, I do want to call out one additional game added to the Last Chance to Play section for the PS Plus Extra and Premium game catalog. So this one showed up a week after, but now you have about 3 weeks left to play this one game, which is 1111 Memories Retold. So that one showed up a little bit later. So just an FYI, for those that did not check out that section or see our last week PSA, this new game was added, so that one is going to expire on December 16th. But moving on to our main news stories, and beginning with some PlayStation Studios news, we have some stuff going on for Naughty Dog's new IP, Intergalactic: The Heretic Prophet, where we should, 1, not expect this game at the TGAs next month, and 2, the game will not come out in 2026. And we got this information from a very annoying ordeal that played out. So initially what did happen here was Colin Moriarty of the Sacred Symbols podcast and Last Stand Media, he was guesting on another podcast on Dan Allen Gaming's channel, talking about a number of different things. And so when talking about Intergalactic, Colin was speculating about the game, saying he thinks we'd see it at the TGAs. He wouldn't be surprised about that. It was his opinion that the game may launch in 2026, like towards the end of the year, something like that, using that kind of language. I think it wouldn't surprise me, my opinion. And so that was then shared around on the Gaming Leaks and Rumors subreddit, very clearly being passed off as if it was information Colin was putting out there as a rumor. But Insider Gaming and a few other gaming websites were then picking up this story, not doing their own due diligence to hear exactly what he was saying, or even doing that and still passing it off as if it was a rumor. But shortly after this, we had Jason Schreier of Bloomberg reply on Reddit saying the game is not coming out in 2026. And then Jeff Grubb also, quote, retweeted the news saying it will not be shown at the Game Awards. So number one, it is always nice to hear that, hey, just an FYI, this game's not showing up at this upcoming event, or it's not going to be released based on the timeline that people are speculating about. And Jason has already said that much for this game anyway, so that tracks that the game is likely a 2027 title, somewhere around there. But, the weird thing is that technically those are still rumors on their own because they don't work at Naughty Dog. That's not official info, but they're well sourced. But that's the thing, is the technicality of it and how these things often get misconstrued so easily. I mean, I'll be honest, this is like a huge pet peeve of mine, is just where gaming news is nowadays and how everything gets shared around so quickly, and it's the telephone game. But how are we messing it up almost right away when somebody listens to the podcast? And sure, Colin is somebody that historically they worked at IGN, went off and did Kind of Funny, but they had a career in games, they had contacts, they don't really chase news stories anymore nowadays. And so when he's speaking on a podcast and he's saying very deliberately he thinks, oh, this is my opinion. Like, if they're clearly speculating, I don't know how somebody listens to that and just thinks like, oh, they're actually putting out crazy information and this is a big rumor. Let me go put it up on the Gaming Leaks and Rumors subreddit. And then how do, like, well-established news organizations, or you would think, how are they not doing their own due diligence and either one, checking the original source and seeing what exactly was said to parse out the story and see if it's legitimate, or maybe they are doing that and they still came to the same conclusion of, oh, this is a headline. How are we constantly doing this over and over and over again? And then it's the same thing with Twitter, for example, where there's only so many characters you can fit in a singular post, and nobody ever wants to put the source in the original tweet, right? It's always a follow-up tweet where the vast majority of people are not seeing that, and the telemetry is public. You can see how often people are not seeing the secondary post versus the front, and so oftentimes just that basic tweet where Dexerto's just putting something out with maybe a handful, like maybe a sentence is what they're bothered to write about a particular news story. And plausibly it's like, oh yeah, they're kind of saying the truth, but sometimes not necessarily. There's much needed context for every news story, every headline. And I don't know, man, like, it's annoying. I've been doing this long enough to where I try to make it, I've tried to really refine news reporting in that way. Like, I don't go for my own scoops, obviously, but I think it's very important to try and go to the exact source of what was said, find the quote, listen to what was said if it's a video, try to get good translation on something that is overseas. Do the very best to provide context on news stories so people are well informed about what you hear about. And that's why oftentimes once we have LTPS at the end of the week, I say, hey, you may have heard about this. Here's what actually played out, because I assure you that you likely have seen something that might have led you astray as far as where that news story was actually going. So, like, I don't know, man. It's definitely a very frustrating thing, I find. And, I don't know, sometimes these news sources or people that have Twitter accounts and report news, like they'll say, oh, my bad, I'll take the L on this one. Oh, will you? Will you really? Or are you just going to do the same damn thing next week? Because you're trying to grow your own social media presence, and, truth is not something that really matters to you in the grand scheme of things, because you just can't pay attention for 2 seconds or listen to what people are saying. Rant over. It sucks, and I know I'm not perfect, but I try to make sure we do every story justice. So with that in mind, hey, Intergalactic, don't expect it at the TGAs, and it's probably, not coming out next year, but man, I hate to see this stuff happen. Next up, Ghost of Yōtei's version 1.1 patch is now live on PSN. This is the patch with New Game Plus, new trophies, new content, and also a bunch of quality of life improvements as well. One of them is auto pickup for resources from downed enemies. That is a godsend. I know Horizon got that much later from when the game initially came out, so for a lot of people you didn't really have the chance to experience or use that, so it's very helpful. I myself still have not started Yōtei just yet, so I'm kind of loving that by the time I get to it, I now have access to that, and also VRR as well. So that's the big news item, is that the game now has variable refresh rate, 120 Hz, so it offers both smoothed and uncapped options. There's a new balanced graphics mode it targets 40 FPS. You can do a balanced graphics mode, or you can do ray traced balance, both targeting 40 FPS, and you can play with an uncapped frame rate as well. So that is excellent. It kind of is a bummer that wasn't there day one, and you can tell that was clearly something they were very close to probably shipping. Well, maybe not on the Gold Master, but, by the time they were ready to ship a day one patch, because there really is not a big time delta here. So it really does kind of suck for those that just wrapped up the game, but at least it was relatively close. So if there were some stragglers like myself where you're going to start the game very soon, or maybe over the holiday season, then you have some excellent options for 40 FPS, ray tracing, balanced, and also uncapped options. Moving on to Death Stranding 2 on the Beach, where the game was recently rated for PC by the ESRB, so indicating a PC release probably is not too far behind. If you remember DS1, it was like 8-something months from the PS4 version to the PC release. This time around, maybe 6 months, something like that. But actually what's more pertinent here is that the publisher listed for the PC version is SIE, Sony Interactive Entertainment. So previously 505 Games publish the first game on PC. So now it seems like Sony has wised up to the idea of, well, let's make sure we publish on PC, which, as a reminder, the IP now belongs to Kojima, so it was some sort of 5-year thing where the IP was handed over at that point. But, bearing in mind that this would have been 2019, well before, well, the game shipped 2019, but prior to that, when the game was still being made and the deal was originally inked, that was a PlayStation that was not doing PC games. So they probably had very little interest in publishing the game on PC, and that was not an opportunity they were willing to take on, versus nowadays where they will do that all day, every day. So not a big deal, but something where it was definitely noteworthy that it's not 505. Sony was willing to pick up the mantle on this one. In other PC news, PlayStation has made about $1.5 billion in total revenue since selling their first-party games on Steam. Now that 1.5 is before Steam's cut, so after it would be about 1.2 billion, but we do have that number from Alinea Analytics where they put out this report for the PlayStation PC business, and so it's about 1.5 revenue total, after cut 1.2 billion. Helldivers 2 is predicted to be the best-selling game by far. After that would be Zero Dawn and God of War, but they did also note that the sales pace for the more recent titles is much slower, suggesting the novelty of these games has worn off on PC, where in some cases the sequels are only doing half what the previous games did, and we can see that from peak player counts, where that's never the most reliable number because it's only a peak player count, not sales data, but it's the only public thing that we have. But still, it's something where you look at that and go, oh geez, it's not really doing what the games previously used to do. So there's been a lot of discussion surrounding this topic. It's been quite fascinating seeing people go back and forth on this, where it's like 1.2 billion is a lot, but wait a minute, it's not a lot, because, for context, PlayStation the last quarter, so for 3 months of the business, the entire business did $7 billion. So they can do that in 3 months versus 1.2 billion from not all of them, but most of their back catalog of late life cycle PS4 and most of the PS5 games. They've got a good portion of those titles on PC now, so they've caught up with a lot of them, and they all did 1.2 billion. So mind you, that's first party, but it's just, for some, there's a back and forth on, is the juice really worth the squeeze? Now, I would posit here that the thing to always consider is that, sure, 1.2 billion may or may not sound like a lot, but you have to break it down on an individual game-by-game basis, because this is really important for these studios. Each game has its own P&L statement. So that additional PC launch, where it's doing even just 10, 15% more in revenue, I mean, that's big, and that really helps these games that are incredibly costly to make. So it's not necessarily about, looking outside and looking at that entire number. It's more about the P&L statement for each individual studio and game. And so in a lot of cases, even for Ragnarok, Forbidden West, and of course Spider-Man 2, these games really do need that extra little bit. So I'm not sure if I'm really inclined to say that PlayStation is really going to take a backpedal on the PC stuff, since there was some very inconsistent, not reliable rumors that were floating around about 1.5, 2 weeks ago that we didn't even bother covering. I would be inclined to say that PlayStation is always analyzing their PC approach and carefully considering where they go from here, because they do have a lot of data now and they have shipped a lot of games. So moving forward, what does that release timing look like, especially when we also consider that they may do their own launcher, their own store, where they can recognize full revenue on that PC store. That, and also it's weird because if they do cross-buy, that's still one individual license per se between PlayStation 5 and PC, so it's not necessarily an extra game they're selling, but that's the thing. It gets kind of complicated as far as how Sony wants to navigate it, but I'm inclined to say they're not really going to move away from this strategy anytime soon, outside of maybe release timing, if they want to move it up to encourage stronger PC sales, considering what they've seen with the more recent stuff, or if they want to stick to what they've been doing so far and providing a first-class experience for PlayStation console owners with those first-party games shipping there first, maybe ship first on their PC store, and then the Steam one comes out a year later or something arbitrarily. It really depends on how Sony does it. I'm not them, nobody's them, right? So we have to just take a seat back and see what they plan on doing from here with that 1.2 billion that they've earned. Let's move on to some Bungie news here with a very early, if you take it with a small piece of salt, rumor about Destiny 3 being in early active development. So this rumor comes from the Twitter account Colony Deeks, someone in the community known for data mining the game and also leaking accurate information in the past. I cannot speak to that whatsoever, so if anybody else is more privy to what's going on in the Bungie space, please chime in. But they do claim that Destiny 3 is in extremely early development, and this is info they've sat on for a few weeks, and they felt the need to finally acknowledge it because there was a tweet earlier from somebody else that dropped this. So they thought, okay, now I'll chime in, and yes, I've heard the same thing. And so, again, rumor. I'm not sure how much to really humor it because I thought that was the whole thing with Bungie, is that they were exploring Destiny 3 early on, and that was shot down pretty fast by studio leadership. And so that's something that they actively chose not to do. But I guess the one aspect to humor is that Bungie nowadays is more tightly integrated into PlayStation Studios, and so with leadership changeover, there's maybe the idea that the current Bungie staff is more open and they have more autonomy to maybe pitch a Destiny 3 and get a very tentative green light based on certain milestones. And if it is very, very early, then of course the game is so far away, so it's hard to even have this conversation because this could very likely just end up being a nothing burger. So having said that, maybe that is the one aspect to consider. I know that when we record Click R3 and me and John talk about Bungie, this is always a point John loves to make, which is they should have just did Destiny 3. And I'm inclined to agree. I mean, the thing with Destiny 2 is that, like, I can't speak to the game's roadmap and content. Like, I wasn't there, right? So I can't really speak to it. But what I can say is that for somebody that is a prospective player, you know, that's the problem people complain about, is that, well, it just feels somewhat insurmountable that there's just so much content there. And so new player onboarding is a problem with Destiny 2. And so in a weird way, you know, in some cases, a live service game doesn't need a numbered sequel, and you can just sort of play it and jump in whenever you want, and it's very conducive to that experience. Whereas Destiny is kind of on the opposite end of maybe there should be an end-of-life plan for D2 and just move on to a proper D3 and sort of reinvent the wheel with that IP and reinvigorate it in a way. So I'm inclined to agree with that. I think that maybe is the play that they should go down. But again, I'm not a Destiny player, so I can't really speak on that topic with too much authority. But that's sort of where I would feel from the outside looking in. In other Bungie news, there is going to be a new marathon playtest happening very soon. It runs from December 12th to the 16th, and you can sign up right now on Bungie's site, asking for any platform, PC, Xbox, PlayStation. I believe they are going to let in a lot more players this time around, so it's definitely worth trying if you're looking to test out the game. You are going to be under strict NDA, so you're not allowed to say or talk or record anything about the game, but based on how many people they do or do not let in, that might be very hard for them to really keep in that knowledge, because with more people, it just becomes a bit insurmountable unless SIE gets really aggressive with takedown notices and things like that. But otherwise, yeah, this is going to be a bigger playtest, which they've been running them, and I keep hearing that they are making genuine improvements to the game and listening to that player feedback very closely. And that is the way to do it. I mean, there is a lot riding on this game, and they do still intend on releasing it fairly soon, so you would think they want to open up that player funnel even more so to get a bigger sample size on the exact pain points and criticisms that they're receiving for this game. And so we'll see how they handle that with the upcoming playtest from, again, December 12th to the 16th. Next up, I'm sure a lot of you probably have heard this story in some way, shape, or form, but there has been a global crisis going on with RAM prices. So DRAM prices are skyrocketing because of a recent deal that OpenAI signed with Samsung and SK Hynix, where they're going to use up about 40% of the global supply of DRAM. So right now, all companies, manufacturers, anything that uses RAM, it's a fight for the remaining 60%. And so there's this idea and worry that the shortages could go into, well into 2026, possibly into 2027. So as a result of that, RAM prices have been skyrocketing. It's absolutely insane how some consumer modules have gone up by 50% in price, but easily 100, close to 200%. And so the concern now becomes, are prices going to go up on existing products like PlayStation 5? Well, based on a rumor from Tom over on their channel, Moore's Law is dead. They were checking in with supply chain sources, retail sources, about which products will be the most affected. And so Tom gave a tier list here, but Tom did say that for Sony, they are pretty low on this list because they have stockpiled a lot of RAM, months worth of components, because they thought this problem was on the horizon. So they were privy to it and were able to plan accordingly. Now, that is a rumor. We'll see if PS5 prices go up or not, but that's another unforeseen consequence of just the current global, not even economy, but it's like there's the tariffs that are more an economic problem, and then there's the AI situation, which is, that's the bubble that people keep expecting to burst anytime soon because there is crazy investment in R&D going on in that space. And OpenAI has a very vested interest in doing that, which is why they sort of went off secretly to sign these 2 deals with Samsung and SK Hynix to secure such a massive supply of RAM, which now puts the strain on other consumer electronics, but also, crucially, other AI companies as well. So with PlayStation, I guess we'll see. I mean, the thing is, this does track with what they did previously with PS5 consoles themselves, where they stockpiled about 3 months of consoles here in the US before tariffs really kicked into insane rates. And so you could see that's how Sony was sort of navigating that, to where they could just barely keep that price increase away, and now it's here at $50 across every console that they offer. So let's hope, fingers crossed, it doesn't get any higher, because the consoles should be getting cheaper, but that's not the world we live in nowadays. So now the hope is that they don't get more expensive, but the RAM thing is just another issue on top of everything else around us getting expensive. This also just, it blows because it's like everything, dude, is so much more expensive. So God forbid you want to do a PC build nowadays, or any other product that you're thinking about buying. Well, now that too may have another consequence of the prices going up and the manufacturer getting away with that, because if they can bake in that price and normalize it, you can be rest assured that they might keep that price the same well into 2027 with the RAM prices coming down. Now, we do have some more hardware news, which is some sales data for that PlayStation 5 Digital Edition Japanese language only model, which is supposed to have a reduced price, which it's still not as cheap as the PS5 was in 2020, but it is still substantially cheaper than the model. Well, it was basically the same model, but the one before it, which the week before this model came out, Sony only sold 489 units reported by Famitsu for that week. So in 1 week, less than 500 units. The following week, that jumped to 23,000 units. So definitely a meaningful spike as consumers were waiting to ignore the existing model and buy this new one that was introduced. So obviously it's still not doing Switch numbers, nothing insane like that. Oddly enough, the PS5 Pro did really well that week as well, but it's something where it will at least hopefully revitalize PlayStation 5 console sales a little bit in Japan. Ideally, I think it would be great if they could somehow get the price down even more, but well, considering the previous news story, that's likely going to be very tough for the company. Let's move on to some third-party news stories here, beginning with Xbox Game Studios and how their developers are apparently very happy shipping their games on PlayStation 5. So recently, speaking with 404 Media, we had Bloomberg's Jason Schreier talking about the Xbox games transition with shipping games on PlayStation 5, and he gave a quote here where he says, quote, "A lot of these Xbox first-party games are put on Game Pass, which means they're not selling as much because people can just subscribe and get them for much cheaper than they would have if they bought them. That complicates the math for a lot of these studios. A lot of game studios are now actually thrilled that they get to release their games on PlayStation, which is a recent phenomenon that's been happening in the last year or so." So this actually goes quite nicely with our previous story about the PC revenue and how the one big number is something you can look at, but it's very important to analyze the individual titles as well, because it really helps the studio's profit and loss statement for each game individually. And so that would be the same thing for Microsoft and their games as well. Their model is definitely a bit more complex, and I'm not sure exactly how that ties in with how the parent organization evaluates each studio, because their games are also benchmarked on Game Pass, and there's, sort of opportunity cost there that gets factored in. That's why that conversation is always like really muddy and weird, but you have to figure anything that improves their numbers with it also being on Game Pass is something they would be quite happy about. And certainly with this mounting pressure from the parent organization and trying to hit some very unrealistic margins, right? So each studio is probably very much thrilled to be improving their margins with PlayStation releases. I will also add, I think a lot of developers are always happy, period, with their games going to more platforms and their games being exposed to more players. For the most part, everybody that works in the games business, there is certainly a sense of pride if they're at a first-party studio, and there's always like a reverence and appreciation for the platform that you make games for. But at the end of the day, they're also very happy to see more people play their games. They're very proud about that stuff. So there's that angle to consider as well. It's not always about the money. Sometimes the on-the-ground, character artist that is making this cool thing, they want as many people to see that as they possibly can. In other Xbox Game Studios news, we're also hearing from the Bethesda Game Studios director, Tom Mustaine, about how they want to do more shadow drops. In particular, this is Todd Howard, where they've really been pushing for this. And so he recently said that the studio has been pushing for more shadow drops, and that's something they really do want to keep trying, which that is something that pertains to the recent shadow drop of Oblivion Remastered. Because the value there is that, hey, here's this really cool thing, and it's available right now. And shadow drops are definitely fun. There's that novelty to it where it's very exciting, and I get to play it immediately. The one thing, though, is like, okay, well, oftentimes that is just a little bit complicated for some consumers, and that you're buying into something where you don't know the quality whatsoever. Sometimes it's like a known entity, so you know what Oblivion is, but the issue with that is that you buy and download the game, and turns out it has a litany of issues. So oftentimes these things can be alleviated, or at least known for the consumer, when at the very minimum it's announced and there's like a review embargo that takes place, right? So there's a weird push and pull there, because I do love shadow drops, but sometimes that can get ugly very fast. So I'm not sure I want that all the time. The other thing too, and maybe this is more of a me thing, but I still like the sort of build up to a game. And so shadow drops can sometimes, they're exciting, but you might lose that if the thing leaks out ahead of time. And so, I don't know, like, it's very hard to keep something secretive all the way up to launch, even if it's announced, let's say. Building up to the shadow drop, like, that news might release in some way, shape, or form, either from ESRB ratings or something even more silly like a store listing. Like, I don't know, like, shadow drops are best when they truly are surprising, and if you're like really following core gaming news, it's really hard for them to pull that off as well. Next up, we have some Ubisoft news, which is Beyond Good and Evil 2 is still alive, even though we had a re-reveal back in 2018, so that was 7 years ago now at this point. But the game is still actively being worked on based on some new job postings where they were listed in France, and it does specifically call out this game. So there's a job posting for a technical sound designer, senior character artist. These job descriptions, are sort of high-profile job listings for a project, so it might be somewhat indicative of the game still needing a lot of work, and that was after 7 years of a re-reveal, so the game is still actively being worked on. I guess that's the news. But man, who knows when it will finally come out, or if Ubisoft is really committed to making sure this thing does actually end up getting out there at some point. They were able to make the entire remaster in this time, which is not super resource intensive. They surely do have an interest in the property, but they must not be able to find the sequel in the way that they want to, because it's just been so long. In other Ubisoft news, the Sands of Time remake is probably coming out very soon, based on a recent report where, well, first off, we had Ubisoft confirm this in financial earnings, where they did say the game is going to ship before April 2026, And now, based on a report from Tom Henderson, writing for Insider Gaming, the game is scheduled for mid-January 2026. So this might be either an intended shadow drop from Ubisoft, which might happen, but also more likely is them at least announcing and opening up pre-orders for the game during the TGAs. Because we are getting very close to the TGAs, so it's something where we're seeing a handful of things trickle in where it's like, oh, that's probably a TGA announcement. In other Ubisoft and also Gen AI news, we have Ubisoft commenting on how they're planning on utilizing AI, and unsurprisingly, they are planning to definitely use it in a very, what appears to be aggressive manner. So we have some new comments from the CEO, Yves Guillemot, about how Gen AI is going to be utilized in their games. So when speaking directly to investors, very important there, he did say they're making great strides in applying Gen AI to high-value use cases that bring tangible benefits to players and teams. He also described it as being as big of a revolutionary shift as 3D was for the business, and also talking about how their Neo NPCs are going to incorporate this in their games, so they're going to be more unique, more responsive, and give players a more, personalized experience. With Ubisoft, I think a lot of people come to this conclusion of, oh, I don't really trust you at all to utilize this technology or to utilize it in what feels like a very organic manner. And of course, my issue has always been when it gets very much into the creative side of things. But, it sort of dials back to the Square conversation with wanting to use AI for QA. When it becomes a task that is kind of insurmountable for humans, that is where it can be a safe extension of human work. Do I think Square can navigate that safely and also not cut into human work? No, not at all. And so it's the same thing here for Ubisoft, where in theory on paper, it actually does sound like an engaging experience to where you could have NPCs be far more dynamic in ways they never reasonably could if you were to throw human work at it. But it's just a matter of, okay, well, I think that is going to be a situation where it creatively cuts into the human work and that creative human touch. So Ubisoft, they tend to get a very bad rap as a big publisher, and when they make comments like these to investors, I'm sure that's something they love to hear, but for the core gaming audience, not so much. Next up, there's been a lot of talk about the Steam Machine and what this sort of pseudo-console PC experience will do for the business, if it will or will not cut into console sales. But really, the overarching issue is the price tag, which we don't have, and that's something Valve is not talking about. It was a pretty big story when they initially announced the Steam Machine, but then shortly after we had this scenario where Linus Tech Tips was recounting something at the preview event where he asked about the price tag, if it's going to have a console price tag, and they didn't really say anything. He said the energy in the room wasn't great. Well, now we have an official comment from Valve about the price tag, and so recently in an interview with SkillUp, Valve's Pierre-Loup Graffas said, quote, "I think that if you build a PC from parts and get to basically the same level of performance, that's the general price tag we aim to be at. We'd like to be competitive with that and have a pretty good deal, but we're working on refining that. Right now is not a good time to have a good idea of what the price is going to be because there's a lot of external things going on." SkillUp then replies, so it's not going to be subsidized, that's not in the fourth. They respond, quote, "It's more in line with what you can expect from the current PC market." So it does sound as though this thing on paper could be in the $600, but really maybe $700-ish neighborhood. Now the whole pitch is still that it's a very small form factor box that's kind of set it and forget it, the console plug and play experience with SteamOS. So there is definitely an appeal there for, I would think, a very niche audience. But it's not going to be subsidized quite like a console. Which you might ask why they're not doing that. And initially I thought, maybe they should do that. But the thing is, that kind of gives a very open exploit for enterprise, and that big companies could buy these things en masse, install Windows on these things, and all of a sudden they've got a highly subsidized PC that is not going to see any Steam sales because they're meant for enterprise work, a work environment. So you can't really subsidize what is basically a PC at the end of the day, because Valve is still, that's part of their pitch. The Steam Machine is a thing you can do whatever you want with, and you can install anything else on it if you so wish to do so. So, yeah, it's not quite a console in that respect. This still kind of, it's more what I said before. Like, I don't think this is going to cut into consoles at all. I think PlayStation is totally fine. More so, I think PlayStation, like, this really is the key advantage they have with PlayStation 5, even the Pro, and going into PlayStation 6, is that if they want to protect that console audience and potentially try and grow it, I mean, it doesn't really grow. It hasn't grown in, decades. But if they have any sort of avenue to do that in what is a very price-sensitive environment, they can do that pitch of like, hey, well, this is a plug-and-play box, and we have economies of scale in our favor, and we can price this thing very aggressively. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where 3 of you could win a code for Morsels on PlayStation 5, which came out very recently. And I would like to congratulate these viewers right here. I'll be contacting you all very soon via email or X. And thank you again to Annapurna Interactive for the opportunity. And now we will be going back to a $10 PSN code. So if you would like to win, then follow the link down below or scan the QR code and enter the Gleam giveaway. And supporting this channel a number of ways can gain you an entry. And I'll announce the winner next week because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are all the stories from this past week that I wanted to talk about with you all. And our Tuesday video was another entry in PSR, a PlayStation retrospective. Finally, it's been like nearly a year since the last 2 that we did. I would like to do more of these, but they're really hard to justify when they have not been doing that well lately. But this one was Black Site Area 51, which this game is so bad. And I kind of like doing like the not great titles for this series because they're more fascinating to me with explaining what sort of convoluted plot they were trying to do. And then, of course, the gameplay mechanics that are sometimes experimental, and the performance on PS3 in particular is usually pretty bad. So they're always a mess to go over, but that's the fun and novelty of it. So maybe next year we'll try and spit out like 6 or 8 of them all in a row and see how that does on a weekly basis, since it's tough to do them like one here and then one the following year, you know what I mean? So maybe we'll try and do more sometime next year. But as for Click R3, the podcast, this was a holiday weekend, so we're probably just going to save that for next week. And that, I think, is pretty much it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.